The brilliance of Buddy Franklin.
Man running back towards the goal. Screwy kicks it through on the ball.
Have a look at this piece of magic.
The jaw-dropping talent of Adam Goods.
Awesome mark.
Nicky Winmar's courage and grace.
Nicky Winmar kicks. Oh, Nicky's goal.
Oh, that is a magnificent goal.
Farmer, a 50-yard hand pass.
For generations, Indigenous footballers have been instrumental in taking Australia's game to spectacular heights.
Part of the reason I fell in love with Aussie rules football was because as a child it's one of the times that I saw Indigenous people cheered for and celebrated.
But as the AFL celebrates its Indigenous round, concerns have been raised over the league's ability to recruit and retain First Nations footballers. In 2020, 87 Indigenous players were plying their trade in the league. 4 years later, it's down to 71. A decade ago, 17 Indigenous players were drafted into the AFL. In last year's draft, it was just 4.
Is that getting to the point where we consider this a crisis?
Clearly it's a concern that the number year on year is less.
Geelong great and Indigenous footballer Matthew Stokes was recruited from the Northern Territory in 2005 and retired in 2016. Do you think it's harder to be drafted now than it was back in your day?
I think it's harder. These days clubs are trying to look at no risk, and I think sometimes, unfortunately, the way that footy departments are set up, and even recruiting, and even AFL itself, are tailored to making sure that the risk is sort of pushed to the side a little bit, or the players who might be challenged or have challenges don't get the opportunity they should.
Kevin Sheehan is the AFL's National Talent Manager and has identified some of the AFL's best ever Indigenous players, including Lance Franklin, who he saw playing as a 16-year-old in Western Australia.
An amazing young talent right from then, and to see his career unfold the way he entertained the masses at both Hawthorn and Sydney was just one of the thrills of my football lifetime, no doubt in the world.
When Lance Franklin was drafted in 2004, 3 of the top 10 draftees were Indigenous. This year, recruiters believe it's possible that only one First Nations player in a pool of about 80 young prospects will be selected. That's worrying Laura Kane, the AFL's General Manager of Football.
To have a suggestion that only one player would be drafted is something that doesn't sit comfortably with either of us or anybody at the AFL.
For the next 5 weeks, the best 150, 160 odd players from around Australia trial in front of the clubs, and yeah, the numbers will be down. We know that of the Indigenous boys. The trials have all taken place, so you've seen that.
Kevin Sheehan has been recruiting for almost 30 years and says the competition for the best talent is as fierce as ever.
There's no doubt in the world that our sport, like all of the others, has got competition. That's the reality, that good kids are not just good at one thing. You know, if you're talented at footy, you probably could be a great soccer player. You're probably very good at basketball.
AFL executives Laura Kane and Tanya Hodge acknowledge the league has a problem.
Our game has actually got a really strong history of seeing Indigenous talent reach the top in quite large numbers, and we want to just keep building on that. So we're very determined to address what's going on at the moment.
They attribute the 18% decline in Indigenous players largely to COVID shutdowns, which restricted recruiters seeing talent in remote areas.
That is a really important piece to understand in terms of why broader regions, rural Australia, was even further disconnected, and the repair job that we have to do to make sure those talent pathways can reconnect and we can see the resources that largely come out of metropolitan cities shared with all kids across all states.
But according to Matthew Stokes, the decline in the number of Indigenous recruits is more complicated.
I've worked in and around the industry for nearly 18 years, and you can kind of see that the decline of the mainstream talent pathways was always going to affect the numbers that we got drafted.
Tanya Hodge, the league's inclusion manager, says the AFL's handling of race issues could also be acting as a deterrent.
As a parent myself, I would absolutely be thinking, okay, what sort of environment is this? But when I speak to other Indigenous players in the game who, are also concerned about the numbers going backwards, that tells me that they believe it is an environment that we need to see more Indigenous people in.
We put more detail or more time into the fluffy stuff around the industry. I mean, our Indigenous jumpers, our welcome to countries, instead of the actual what really needs to change, and that's the actions and the education piece around that, to enable our industry to give a safe space for our players to be able to grow and get the best out of themselves.
Come down to the Oval and spend time with Indigenous kids.
Many champion Indigenous players are offering to mentor the next generation, but the AFL wants more of its past legends to inspire its future stars.
I'm delighted to see Buddy Franklin back out there just last week up in Darwin with a group of kids. We need people like him to inspire the kids, to give them that hope and the dream of one day being able to play.
1, 2, 3.